Policy Initiative, a fantastic research tank based in Beirut, doing work on reforming multiple kinds of policies, including social protection, industrial development policy, and more. They have also been our partners since the beginning in this work with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, supporting, helping, providing space and insights to the conversations. So we're absolutely thrilled to have him direct this panel. I'm also really grateful to our speakers, and we'll ask you to really please keep the time because one of them has to take a plane right after. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona, for this kind introduction. Let me just put things in order for this fifth panel. And I guess we've been here, or you've been here for 2 days. Although I haven't been physically with you, but I'm actually grateful that you're streaming this, by the way. So I was actually able to capture some of the debates online. The panel is called Making It Happen. So we're looking forward to sort of moving the debate a notch in this panel by listening to our distinguished panelists. But let me first start saying a couple of words. When Mona invited me to actually moderate the session, and actually even before, when she sort of looped me into this whole discussion of land value capture, and since we at the center, at the policy initiative, we've been working a lot on different topics, but the whole meaning of capture has a different connotation, particularly when I'm thinking of political and financial elite capturing the state, right? You know, so it's a very different sort of understanding of what we're going to be discussing now, though it's very complementary. We've been sort of looking at, particularly in Lebanon, but I think it applies to many countries, and probably more than that, is how these elites have been able to control the states, whether to design and develop laws that suit them, or spend money or resources or infrastructure for assets or their endowment that will actually increase their value. So it goes on, and we look particularly at, for example, the procurements by the State Planning Commission here, or what's called the Central Council for Development and Reconstruction, and how all these go to highly politically connected firms, as you can imagine, right? Now, what I like about this city debate, and particularly the theme of this year, which was also preceded by other discussions that Mona Fawaz led and still leading with the Lincoln Institute, is it shifts the debate. It shifts the debate. Instead of looking at only how the state is being captured, is how the state can capture that unearned income that Enrique talked about, right? So this is really wonderful in the sense that how do we think about these? What are the tools we should think about? And what do we do with that money? Well, how do we evaluate first, and what do we do with the money? And I feel like this is all a loop or integrated just because we cannot think of them separately, for one. And two, the state could capture these, but if they're not going towards public good ends, then we're not really doing a good job, right? Because there will be a capture somewhere else in that process. So all of this leads us to really open the debate and look at different cases, which we're going to be doing today. And I have 3 distinguished panelists who will be talking about different experiences. So first, I'm going to introduce by the order that was actually provided to me. Astrid Haas will be speaking first. She's an independent urban economist. And she's been working across research and practice, which is wonderful because I think it's really good to actually sort of link those two, and has extensive experience with city governments across Africa and Asia. She's currently an extraordinary lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Pretoria, and a fellow at the Infrastructure Institute at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. And my understanding, she'll be looking at the case of Jordan and looking at the land value capture, which is embedded in the law, and what are the challenges of actually implementing the LVC. This will be followed by Mohamad Nada, who is Senior Urban Specialist for the World Bank's Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land Global Practice in the MENA region. And in his capacity, he's been leading a portfolio of investment projects, program for results, and development policies focusing on decentralization, lagging regions, and property registration. And Mohamad is going to also look at, well, my understanding is that even if we have land value capture in the laws, do they get implemented? What are the limitations for implementing them? And this is really important, again, just because we feel like we need to move the needle further rather than just aim to have them in the law. And lastly, we have actually a very interesting case, which is the case of South Africa. And here, I believe this is actually going to be presented by Claudia Hitzeroth. I believe Helen is here, but I believe that, hi Helen, nice to meet you. Claudia is the project officer at the Development Action Group, a Cape Town-based nonprofit organization specializing in urban land and housing. And her focus of her work is on institutionalizing relevant land-based financing and land value capture in South Africa, metropolitan cities. And what we're going to be hearing from Claudia is the role of civil society and particularly Development Action Group in actually pushing in South Africa the land value capture financing scheme. Looking forward to this discussion. Now, you are given 20 minutes. However, this is conditional on two things. One, but 17th minute, I'm going to tell you have 3 more minutes. And on the 20th minute, I have to be draconian about it. I'm going to have to end it just because we don't want to go over time. All right? Deal. All right. Astrid, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Okay, I hope you can hear me. I speak loudly anyway. Thanks to Mariana for breaking the podium thing before I come. I simply can't use it because I'm short and I would disappear behind it. So what am I going to talk about today? So as Sami has already sort of preempted, it's the case on Jordan. I'm not an expert on Jordan. I was just invited by the Greater Amman municipality, a fantastic group in the planning department there who wanted to, or wants to still, reform their 1966 planning law. And so they asked me to come in and have a look at this and say, could you just give us some thoughts as an external perspective, what this means to you, like looking at the land value capture aspects. And so also Amman is a beautiful city, wonderful to go there, wonderful to look at this. But for me, a very exciting case because everywhere else I work doesn't have these things in law. So this gave me an opportunity to go like, wow, you know, what happens when you can actually do these things legally? And you have the premise to do so. So I had one choice. I could come and I could summarize the case for you, but you know, you're all very intelligent people. It's all written up. You could read it. And I'm not sure that that would necessarily foster a debate, which is what we're here for. So when I was putting these slides together, I was thinking about, what is this that I learned from the Jordan case that I could apply to my own case, Kampala, Uganda, which is a very different situation, very messy, and I'll go into that. And what does this mean? And I also had the benefit of I have the challenge of going on the last panel, which some call the sort of graveyard shift. I do have the benefit though, because I got to change my slides this morning based on all the different questions people asked me and things that I heard. So I hope to be able to do all of this in 20 minutes. So we started yesterday during Rachel's presentation discussing why do you get excited about land value capture? For me, it's simple. I'm an urban economist. The reason it excites me is because it makes money. And that's what I work with cities to do, is I try and help them find ways to increase municipal finance to finance their infrastructure. And guess what? In Jordan, it makes them money, right? So in Jordan in 2018, approximately 60% of their budget came from revenues from land value capture, including property tax, which I think is an important form of land value capture. So this is another exciting case for me. Wow, it's not only in the law, it can make money too, right? Which is really, for me, the ultimate aim. And for all the planners in the room, I actually only came to the planning thing after the money thing. But that's just, my full disclosure. Land value capture, again, is not new, right? So anything, for me, an instrument that can withstand the test of time and withstand the test of different US administrations is an instrument that is pretty, what can we do with that, right? So for me, it's sold itself. It can make money. It's withstood the test of time and sort of different political aims. So how can we make this happen? And how can we make this happen in particularly in rapidly urbanizing environments, which is the ones that I work in, which is also Amman. So Amman between 2004 and 2018, although this only shows until 2014, its population grew from 1.94 million to about 4.2 million. Its actual land area increased by 60%, right? And if this keeps going, by 2030, they estimate another 41.4 kilometers squared will be added to Amman. What does that mean? That means your infrastructure and your service delivery costs go up extensively, particularly if you're starting to distribute outwards instead of in a compact area. So again, some fancy Excel models probably estimated that these numbers come to something like $327 million extra annually in infrastructure costs, $356 million extra annually in service costs. Data out is only as good as data in. I'm not sure where this data comes from. The point is, it's big numbers, right? And if you want to find money to provide those big numbers, you got to look somewhere for it. And as I said, they have this opportunity. It's embedded in not only in the 1966 planning law, it's also in the 1987 expropriation law. Now, you'll also find out from this presentation, I am not a lawyer, but I have mastered the skill of clip art to try and help me understand what it says in laws and try and explain that to people. So it may not be the fanciest presentation, but it helps me understand what the law is trying to tell to me. So this is my clip art explanation of the provisions in the planning and the expropriation laws. I told you. I will say one thing is that clip art has a very strong gender bias, and property developers, which is what this represents, could also be women. So I had to go on an extensive Google search to find a clip art of a female property developer, but I did it. So they have in the law, in Chapter 7, two particular type of what they call development levies, special levies and general levies. The difference of which is not particularly important here because it just means who can issue what, like which level of government, but they function relatively the same way. It is specifically in the law said that the money for this is supposed to cover the extra capital costs that come from a public or a private project, which to us who work in land value capture sounds a little bit like a development impact fee. But it's a bit different. So the way the development impact fee works, as per my clip art explanation, is you have some sort of undeveloped land, you have a property developer who has an idea for a project, this hammer and thing representing the project. They go to City Hall or whichever entity, they pay a fee to get the development rights, and that fee is then invested to develop the land where they do the property. In Jordan, it's a little bit different, which is why it's not quite this fee. In Jordan, it's this model. So in Jordan, you have undeveloped land, you have your male, female property developers. They go to City Hall, they propose a project, they get the development rights, they develop their project, and then, again, male, female lander. I literally couldn't find a female property owner clip art, so I had to transplant a head. But male, female property owners, they actually pay the levy ex post. So they pay the difference in the appreciated value of the land, a percentage on the difference in the appreciated value of the land. So guess what? The property developer actually gets off pretty well here, right? Because they not only get their ability to do the property, they're not actually carrying any of the cost of the extra development, although that's built in. So guess what? This has never been implemented, right? Because when they do try and implement this, they get taken to court. And the two primary reasons they get taken to court is, can you tell me how you calculated the difference between this and this, where you calculated the percentage on? And secondly, why should we pay, right? So it's in the law, it's not used. The second thing that's in the law, which now looks like a little bit like a cell membrane, which is more gender neutral, is betterment levies. So the betterment levies are in the law, and they say, right? That this is for public projects. So this is where the city makes an investment to develop something. And the people who have properties in the sphere of influence of those projects, they in turn pay a levy. And what that levy is supposed to cover, it also says in the law, it's supposed to cover the next public project that the city implements for the expropriation of the land and any construction costs. So this is really supposed to be, we take the unearned increment here and we invest it in there. And the way it's charged is whether you're in a 500 meter or 1,000 meter sphere of influence. If you're in a 500 meter sphere of influence, you pay 20% on the difference between the value of the developed and the undeveloped land. And if you're in the 1,000, you pay 10% of that difference. It says it's in the law. Only implemented in one area of Oman, which is Area C, because guess what? Area C is the most developed, dense CBD area where they have some land numbers where they can actually calculate the value. Everywhere else, they're taken to court and it gets hung up in court. They don't earn anything. So what did they do? Instead of actually going to the law, they now went for an interpretation of the law, which as a lawyer, blows my mind that this is the more accepted version. And they have something that's called compensation fees. Now, compensation fees is not something that's actually in the law. Compensation fees is based on a backward induction of Article 48 and 47. I don't think it really matters because I'm not sure any of you is going to go read the planning law. But there's two articles in the law. And what these articles say is that if the city of Oman or the Greater Oman municipality does anything that causes a fall in value of properties, right? So they rezone something, it becomes more restrictive. They rezone something so you can restrict building heights. They have to compensate the owner. So what the city of Oman did is they interpret that backwards. Well, if we have to compensate them if it falls, guess what? They should compensate us if it rises. And so that's what they do. They charge on rezoning, this compensation fee, and they charge for extra development rights. And you know what? This is the least contested thing in the law, and it's actually not in the law. And I think that's the biggest point that I want to make. So here you have the summary of the three. Number one, in the law, not implemented, taken to court. Number two, in the law, only implemented in Area C, otherwise taken to court. Number three, not in the law, based on some sort of weird interpretation of the law, actually used and creating revenue. And why is that? See, my reading of this situation is it doesn't always matter what's on paper, particularly in places someone was asking with low enforcement. What it actually matters is that you've created this culture by having it in the law, that there is something of an unearned increment somewhere that should be going back to the city. Is this perfect? Absolutely not, because this is because it's not in the law, it's a negotiated thing between, is it probably very leaky? Absolutely, right? People are probably making big money off this, right? But is it generating revenues? Yes, we saw that. It's generating revenues. So we don't always have to go for the first best, wonderfully spelled out in law solution to be able to get the revenues that we need. And then the final bit I want to just say on the Jordan case is that it's not even, there is still a lot of pushback on reforming this law, although someone contacted me on LinkedIn 2 months ago saying they're using my paper now to reform the law. It's nice when you write things and they don't just go into a black hole. Someone actually finds them. But the point is, and this is a big limitation of my own work, which my 2023 resolution is to rectify this, I've looked primarily at the revenue side. It's not land value capture, as Sami said, unless it's actually going back into providing services. So what I want to start doing, probably not in Jordan, because I don't usually work on Jordan, but I want to start looking at how money is actually spent and what it's going to be spent on, because otherwise we're not talking about land value capture. But to date, I admit it, I've only looked at revenues, but these are pretty good revenues that you can generate in a pretty imperfect second, third best solution situation. And here's the learnings. There are many forms of land value capture tools, right? We've talked only about a small amount of them here. We talked about things that the tax increment financing would never work in the context that I live in because we just don't have it. Vacant land tax, probably also not, although we've looked at that on vacant building tax, probably not, but we've looked at it vacant land, right? So you got to pick what's going to work in your own context. So, in my case, so you can generate revenue. And now I come to my own city, again, probably not an expert, but more of an expert than I am on Amman. And my city is like the most complex place that you're going to find to implement land value capture, because not only is it the sprawling, this is, okay, it's quite pixelated, but this is a quite nice picture. My city's a mess. I love my mess, but it's a mess. We have no land cadastre. We don't know who owns what land. We also have this situation in Kampala. So the World Bank did this. I'm not entirely clear, given we have no land cadastre, that this is the exact nature and true, but okay, it just illustrates. In one city, we have 4 different land tenures, 4 different ways that you can own and manage land. And I won't even go into the complexities of each of those tenures, but they're complex. This yellow bit is how much the city actually owns. So the Addis Ababa thing of we own the land and we can lease it, not going to happen. We own less than 10% of the land in the city as a city. So you have a situation, no cadastre, messy tenure. You also have a situation, and because I'm talking about laws, I want to go this, where the law actually says you can't do it. So, and there's a big reason for this. So the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda, which was issued in 1995, after, the end of colonialism, long civil war, put land back in the hands of the people. The Constitution of Uganda says land belongs to the people. Land does not belong to the state. When they were doing land policies and land laws around this, they take that very seriously. So what the Constitution also says is that if you're going to do an infrastructure investment, instead of actually paying a levy or tax, you get compensated by the state for whatever it takes. It says that in our Constitution. On top of it, when they were creating our land policies, and I actually talked to someone who was part of the team that wrote the land policy says no tax on land before we're a middle income country. It says that. And why does it say that? It says that because there is a very colonial connotation to land value capture. This was central. Betterment levies were central to this document, the Town and Country Planning Act, which for all the British in here, and yes, Tom, I'm looking at you. This was one of the worst remnants of colonialism, was this Town and Country Planning Act, but it did have betterment levies. So when they wrote our land laws, they said, actually, no, we want to do the very anti-colonial thing and not put those in because that came from the British, right? So we have a legal situation which actually says you can't do it, right? So we have an administrative tenure and a legal situation. So what hope does this give us? Why am I even standing here? Why do I even work on this? Well, I think that's where the Jordan situation has a lot to tell us. Because there are many different instruments you can still use, and they should be context specific. Property tax being one of them. This is the new cadastre that they put together, the property cadastre. And we are, and Tom even gave us kudos for this, gave Kampala kudos for this. We've increased property tax revenues by significant amounts through ways that we are able to do on property tax registers. For me, property tax is actually one tool that we should look at in terms of land value capture, and we should look at very seriously. But Tom, to your point, I don't think it's the only tool, because nothing is a silver bullet. Nothing is going to solve all the problems. Another thing that's happening in Kampala, and this is really important because this is not even state-led, is land readjustment. And we haven't really talked about that so much. I know Dr. Turk mentioned it briefly in her thing. Land readjustment is simply when you're going to build a road, you say, person A, your value is going to increase because of that road, or person B, your value is going to increase before. So give us a little bit of space on your land to build that road, and you still maintain, in this picture, you still maintain the same value, but in some cases your value will go up. In this case, this is a government project, so the government keeps the extra land. In our case, it's not being driven by our government. Our government does not have the capacity to do this. Our government doesn't have the capacity to do very much. This is being driven because landowner A, landowner B, and landowner C know that that road is really necessary for them, know that their value is going to be going up, and so actually give it. And even where this is state-led, it doesn't have to be expensive. This is another place I work. This is Somaliland. Somaliland is an unrecognized country. It doesn't receive that many aid flows for the fact that it's unrecognized, and aid is a very weirdly nationalistic Westphalian concept that can only go government to government. But it is a city that has figured this out. And what it's figured out is where the city is growing. And it's just demarcated plots. This is a picture from the plane. And what it's doing is it's saying, look, you can settle here, but keep here and here free, because when we have the money, we'll build some roads or our water lines. Just don't settle on it, because moving you is going to be more expensive. But now people know, okay, the government is thinking about this. Why don't I settle here? And in the future, I may have it. And this type of land value capture doesn't involve the handing over of cash. It is conceptually the same thing, because you're working with value, but you're not working with cash, which again can be very leaky in some concepts, right? And you're working from the grassroots. You're not relying, I mean, in this case, the government is working on it. In the Ugandan case, it's just people in neighborhoods doing it. And really, we should be encouraging that. So I started in Jordan. I ended in Kampala, two very, very different contexts. You know, maybe one shouldn't draw conclusions, but I do think that the two things I want to say is we need to do it as an African continent. We're the fastest urbanizing continent at the moment. We're not going to be able to pay for all this infrastructure if we don't think creatively and figure out how we're going to do it, right? That we don't really have a choice not to think about all options. And it doesn't require rocket science to calculate value. This is Nairobi in Kenya. It's approximately the same place. 1980, 2016. Clearly, there's some sort of increase in value, right? We don't need fancy Excel models. We can see it. So how can you tap into that? So here's what the, you know, given we have to do it, here's what the Jordan model taught me, right? The Jordan model taught me it can be done, but it doesn't even necessarily need to be in law. What it needs to have some sort of understanding or public buy-in that this is a thing. It needs to be context specific, and it needs to make sense. It doesn't have to be the first best textbook solution. And I think importantly, in no case is it a silver bullet. Like we can't just rely on one thing. We're not talking here that land value capture is going to do everything. It's just a part of a toolbox. So I just want to end on my final quote, because I found this out a couple of weeks ago, that the Colombian Constitution actually has in their collective rights land value capture in there as society's participation in the uplift. And I think if we can reframe the land value capture, which sounds pretty brutal in terms of, you know, a communications tool, to something like this, which makes a lot of sense conceptually, but also better marketing strategy, I think we have half the way forward. So Sami, I hope I kept time. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time.
Astrid. Indeed, you did. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Again, this is exactly what I meant to say, but I didn't really expect that this conversation is going to take us to pushing for the informal now, right? From being formal to the informal and the implication of all of that. So Astrid, I'm going to leave you with one question that you can come back to after we finish, is that really, what's really the implication of all of this? Because I really think, and I like the fact that you're arguing that we need to think outside the box right here, right? And thinking of Jordan particularly, where actually the formal doesn't get implemented, the informal gets implemented. And it's great, but what's the implication of that? Who benefits from this? Who actually pays the cost from all of this? But anyway, I'll leave this for the discussion. Mohamad, I'm going to invite you to come and speak about Egypt and the MENA region. The floor is yours. Again, 20 minutes, 17, you'll get a sign from me.
So basically, I'll be presenting the same topic.
Sorry, can you press it on?
Oh, perfect, thanks. But within the Egyptian context. I'll be looking at an example, a city in the heart of the Delta in Egypt called Banha. But this is not a special case. This is actually the norm. I've been following this city and 6 other cities across the Delta and the Nile, and see actually what is happening on planning urban expansion across all these cities. What is very unique in Egypt is that the population are all living, most of the vast majority of the population are living in the delta and the valley, and these are almost, I would say, even 90-something% private land. It's owned by the people. What happened in the 50s in Egypt is that actually we start to move into land reform. And what Nasser did at that time is that he started to take the land that belonged to big tycoons, divide it into 5 acres for small-scale farmers at the time, and that's it. But what happened from the 1950s until today is actually the land became extremely fragmented. So what used to be a 5 acres plot that is owned by one household, there is now thousands of people at the same plot. So how to manage urban expansion? I'm like in Africa, in Asia, this is where the urbanization is taking place, and the outskirts of the city are expanding so quickly. So my focus didn't start with looking at land-based financing. It actually looked at how cities are being expanding and how we can manage urban expansion. So in Egypt, we have a law called 119 for the year 2008, and it says, this is the city, we need to develop a strategic plan for the city. So this would mean is that if this is the boundary of the city, through the strategic plan, we need to expand. So where to expand? This is an agricultural land, for example. Then no longer this will be the urban growth boundary. The urban growth boundary, for example, will be this. All this agricultural land, which is in yellow or here in purple, this will become an expansion areas. And these expansion areas can be either residential, the yellow color, or industrial. I'm focusing on these parts, and actually in this exact spot, I spent the last 15 years going to that spot and trying to understand what is actually happening. For 15 years, 1-5, and you will see. So that's the process. The process is we do a strategic plan. We identify where are the expansion area, and this is done within the bigger understanding of what happened in the city, what is the population growth, what is the economic potential of the city, et cetera, where are the services, and so on and so on. So the strategic plan said this is the expansion area. So that's the first part. This is the urban growth boundary, and this means that any expansion that happen here will become informal. Expansion can happen here, and this is now residential, this is industrial. Okay, so next step, can then I plan immediately here or build here? No. We need to go into another layer of planning according to the law, which is called detailed planning. And this look like this. So we take this area, and we start to detail how it's gonna look like. This will be public building, this will be streets, this will be residential blocks, etc. So that's how it is being done. In the legal framework, Ministry of Housing is the one that do the strategic planning. Local government is the one that do the detailed plan. Okay, is that it? Can I build now? No, you cannot. There's still another layer of planning, which is what is called land subdivision. So if I live here, if my line, for example, is here, then this is a very big block. This is around 1 acre, 1.5 acre. And who owns this? Previously, as I mentioned before the land fragmentation, this used to belong to one person or maybe one family. Now, I'm not joking, this can be 200, 300, and even more in that area. So what do we need to do is exactly what you said, land readjustments. Then this is the one of the key challenges that we have in the Egyptian context. We don't have a land readjustment law. We don't have a process whereby landowners come together and start to discuss how we're gonna subdivide this land, how we're gonna allocate the lands. In the example that you gave in Uganda, it was my assumption it was empty land, it was a state land, or it was a private. Okay, in here it is private, but people will protect the land. They will not allow encroachment on it. So they are not allowing encroachment, but also, and if my land is here and I found a school, what would I do? So basically, I will ignore the detailed plan, and I will start to build informally on, because the state will not give me a building permit. Here is a school. This is a public school, yet this is a private land. It belonged to me, and I don't want to have my land. So the only instrument would be either to do expropriation, which local government doesn't have money to expropriate private land, or to do land readjustment, as you explained. But then we don't have the law. The number of landowners are huge, that they can come together and actually discuss how this area can be developed. So what can be done? So here we will start to have the first deviation. People will start to ignore the strategic plan. They will start to ignore the detailed plan, and they will come together. They will look at the agricultural land, the pattern of the agricultural land, where there is water canals, water bodies, and this will become the street. So I live 2 meters from here, you live 2 meters from here, and this will become the street. So where is public areas, then there is zero. Where is services, there is zero. Whereas you name it, anything of community need, then it isn't. Then that's why if you look at Google Earth and to see how cities are expanding, you will mainly in the vast majority of Egyptian cities, they are expanding as informal. They are expanding following the pattern of the old agriculture water canals pattern, and they are predominantly residential / informal economy. There is hardly any location for services. So that's how we are managing our urban expansion in Egypt. It's mainly informal. You have a legal framework that say strategic plan, Ministry of Housing do it. You have a detailed plan that in theory local development, the municipalities do it or should do it. But in reality, everything of this is ignored, and then we start to develop informally, and people just come together and do it informally. So that's how city expansion look like. Okay, so I told you the last almost 15 years I've been following this. So because it's a very centralized process, it took from 2007 until 2014 just to finish the formal process. Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Housing bring the experts, they go and they develop the strategic plans. It takes forever to approve the strategic. I don't want to go into the details, but it takes forever until the strategic plan is approved. You have what I called the lost years. I don't know what happened. Just people stopped speaking about it. Then they said, okay, let's do detailed plan for that site. Then they start to do the detailed plan. The governor approved in 2014, and then nothing happened. So but from nothing happened from the formal point of view. What is happening on the ground is completely different. From here, from the day the consultant went to do the land surveying and etc., the land prices became like woo. They started to realize that this is no longer an agricultural area. This is actually will be a residential area, or this will be an expansion area. They don't know yet at that time what is happening, but this means that this will be an important part. So the price, by the day the consultants and the people start to do survey work, the value of the land jumped at least 5 times. By the time the boundary committee, which is something in Egypt is very central, approved that this is the new urban growth boundary, and this land are no longer agriculture. This is actually an urban land. Another 5 to 10 times increase in the value happen on that particular land. Then you have the detailed plan approved, and actually nothing really happened. In the value of the because people don't believe on this. They don't put, although in theory this is where the street network would look like, but they know that this street network and the land uses that the detailed plan suggested is actually a joke. We don't want to see it. The only thing that matters is this is no longer agricultural land, it's an urban land. So that's how the process from looked like from the. This is the site that I was telling you about, and people started to, once it became an urban area, they started to do their informal subdivision, completely ignoring what the state is looking at. They started to actually, because they are afraid that actually someone might stop this, they actually started to do imaginary walls. You know, this is my area, don't touch it. Just to make sure that, and this is a context, exactly what you said in your case, in a context where the cadastral system is extremely weak. We don't have a cadastral system. So how to protect my land? We subdivide, we agree together as landowners. We create that this become the street. I will build my wall just to demarcate that this is mine now. And once after some time, nobody contested this, then this become enforceable. This is where the new, whenever I want to start to really build, I will take this out and I'll build the building. And that's it. Okay, so that's the planning part. Then let's look at the land value part. As I mentioned, I was not really keen at the beginning on the land-based financing or the land value capture instruments. I was just trying to see how we can. But then I started to look at the legal framework, and I realized that similar to the Jordanian case, we have something called the betterment levy. Betterment levy goes back, it's a levy that you say, it goes back to 1955 in the Egyptian context. And it basically say any infrastructure that is done that improve the value, 50% of the increase in the value would go to the government. But who actually take this betterment levy? It's not like in the Jordanian context, it goes central. So what is the interest of local government to collect the betterment levy? So that's basically what happened. So we have this, and so according to our legal framework, once the detailed plan, the one that I was showing here, get approved, in theory, the local government should start collecting 50% of the increase in value of the property. But at that time, as I mentioned, the detailed plan didn't increase the value. The value actually increased long time ago when the land changed from agriculture to urban. But we're not looking at this. When do I need to pay the betterment levy in our legal framework? Immediately after after the approval of the detailed plan, I need to pay it either all in cash or in 10 equal installments. So people start at the local government to say, okay, this is not a fair levy. So one, as a local government, I don't benefit from it. Two, it's not fair. You know, the landowner that have their lands approved as part of the urban expansion, didn't yet materialize the increase in the value. It's still an arable land. It's still an agricultural land. It's still an empty land. So why should they pay a levy on it? You know, to them, it will be more acceptable if the person sell the lands and we can get the increase in value. But this is not the case. We have another instrument called the developer exaction, which is in theory when the states start to provide infrastructure to the site, then they start to charge a fee or a developer exaction to the landowners on it. But again, given that the land is divided informally, the state is in a dilemma. Shall we apply the levy or not? If we apply the levy, then in a way we are saying we are consenting that this is a real building. If we don't apply, then so they are not collecting this. We had a vacant land tax in our legal framework. However, it was ruled unconstitutional. And the reason was not that it is not a fair. I think the idea of a vacant land tax is there, but from the constitutional point of view, they said it was set at a very high rate. It was set as 2% of the value, the real value, the monetary value of the property. You pay 2% of it on an annual basis. So our constitutional court said, wow, this is huge. This means in a 50-year, in a way, we have taken by you paying this tax, we have taken the value of the property, and therefore this is not an expropriation, this is a confiscation. So they ruled it unconstitutional. When? In 1996, Till now, nobody have touched this, and this is a dead one. Just like the Jordanian case, we have also the air rights. We used to have it in our legal framework. You know, we're gonna give you for free the first, for example, 2 floors, but then anything above the 2 floors, you need to pay a fee for it. We had the legal framework for it, but then it was stopped. And then nothing happened. So, and then we have the property tax. But the property tax in Egypt can only apply to almost 5% of the property. It apply, meaning is that the vast majority of properties in Egypt are exempted. Why? It is set at a very high rates. We are exempting any property that is valued above 2 million Egyptian pounds. This means that the vast majority, this is a high value in the Egyptian context. This means that the vast majority, in this particular case, this means that none of the properties in this area are actually have property tax. Number 2, where does the property tax go? It goes up. According to the law, 25% should go to the local level. For the past 10 years, 0 went to local government. Everything is kept central. So that, in conclusion, there are plenty of instruments, but how effective are these instruments? Are they the right instruments? Can we apply them? And yesterday there was an excellent presentation about models, about the Excel sheet, in our context, do we actually have an Excel sheet? And then in other cases, if I speak on Banha case, do we actually have the person that will use the Excel sheet or any other forms of, actually there is no capacity even to understand and evaluate property before and after. So how can we apply this? So sometimes the instrument is important, but then you don't have capacity to implement it. Sometimes the instrument is important, but it's set at a very high, collected centrally, or the way it is administered is collected at a very high level. So if I would like to conclude, if I take one step back and say, okay, how we can look from this case, how we can look at this. One, I think we need to look at actors who have capacity to apply these instruments. Who do they have the capacity? Do they have the right intentions, the right motivations, the right incentives to do this? Is the policy framework allowing them to do that? Is the legal? Then 2, I would look at the legal framework. Does the legal framework set? In Egypt, many of these things are important, but the legal framework doesn't exist. And when local governments started to apply it, they got stopped. So similar again to the Jordanian context, sometimes the legal framework is there, like in the betterment levy, but for local government, and here I think the literature on what is so-called the street level bureaucrats is very critical. Local government official might not be convinced actually what is there in the legal framework, and therefore by their own intention they stop it. So then we go to the third part, not only the legal, but let's look at the informal institutional setup. The rule of the games, how people really think about this. Do we understand it? Do we know it? So looking at actors and their interaction, looking at the formal institutional setup, looking at the informal institution, looking at the modes of interaction between the actors, how they work together. In Egypt, local government feel extremely disempowered. Everything is central. We don't have the mandate. We don't have the power. We don't have the interest. We are only the one that get the blame. So understanding the political economy of implementing these instruments, I think, is extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohamad. I actually decided to change the title of this panel. I think it's called Making It Happen. I think we should add Making It Happen informally. So I feel like this is particularly for those who are fighting for better legal framework, right? I mean, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And just before I give Claudia, who I hope will talk about the formal process, Mohamad, just something to think about, like those lost years that you talked about, right? And then you ended up on the political economy question, right? I mean, about the actors, about the formal, informal. And here's I'm really interested to hear from you the mechanics, the relationship between the actors in government and the owners, And how do they actually work together or not work together? How do they collude, you know what I mean, towards an end that actually benefits some over the others, or at least at the expense of the state, if I play it to its end of its conclusion. Claudia, the floor is yours. 20 minutes.
Thank you. I have the lovely shift of being the graveyard shift of the graveyard shift and standing between you and your lunch. So may I please ask everyone to just get up for 2 seconds, stretch and sit back down. But the presenter, I can't see my notes. Thank you. You may be seated. I think I am presenting about formal institutions, but I think the title of the panel is making it happen. But one thing that we haven't talked about particularly is how to make it happen. And so I'll be talking about our experiences over the last 3 years in terms of the methodologies and strategies towards institutionalization of land value capture in South Africa. But I'm from a non-profit organization called the Development Action Group. So you might be asking, why is a civil society organization interested in land value capture? South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. We kind of often, through the years, we often hit the top. It's not a good top to hit, being the most unequal country in the world. What does that mean for our cities? This is what it means for our cities. These are very famous images. It means that you can have an informal settlement, as we see on the left-hand side here, over there. You can have low-income housing, and you can have a gated community on an ecologically important wetland, villas, pools, etc. Right? This is what South African cities look like. Why do we have that? It is a product of apartheid planning. We were talking about the power of planners, and I think the apartheid system shows the power of planning when used by a racist, oppressive scheme on the premise of racial segregation. This is what it looks like, and this is the product of it. So if anyone questions if planners are powerful, yes, they are, right? So this map is from 2001. It's the city that I live in, and it shows you the distribution of where people stay by their skin color. And this was done through planning, but also through forced removals, violence. But now we're 25, 30 years into democracy. And I think something that's important is that image I showed of the informal settlement right next to the gated community is not normally what we see. What we see is spatial segregation. The poor are far removed from the wealthy, right? So these two images, they're not often next to each other. And we have that because of uneven infrastructure investment. So the question is, value creation for who, where, over time. So we're talking about the last 30 years, you have this problematic spatial layout. And now we're seeing increased investment into the well-located areas, which are historically white. So we see land values increasing on one side, on the well-located side, which is pushing out the urban poor to the periphery again. So we're seeing a perpetuation through land markets of segregation and racial segregation. What you'll see here is that our land markets mimic, on the right-hand side, the red is the high land values, mimics the map of racial segregation. And what you'll also find in our current housing market is that housing affordability is decreasing. The average income sits at 20,000 Rand, which means that you can afford either the green segment or the blue segment, which means you're not being served by much of the housing market. So this is what we're facing in Cape Town. And as a civil society organization, we are facing the symptoms of this failing land market every day. In high-value locations and neighborhoods, we're seeing market-led evictions.
that weren't even possible under an apartheid scheme are now happening at the hands of an exclusionary urban land market. This is why we're interested in it. This is why it matters. And people are being moved out of the last few that are still in well-located areas are being moved out to temporary relocation areas very far outside of the city. And this is what someone that Helen worked with this person many years ago. This is what they said after that happened. And we have to remember that everything we're talking about here is fundamentally about people and their experience of the city. And this is the kind of experience of the city that we can have. So as DAG, we work across all of the kind of different housing interventions and land interventions. I have a lot of colleagues, hi Daggies, if anyone's watching, that work in informal settlements, low-income housing, affordable rental housing. But what we became increasingly interested in was a systemic intervention. How do you prevent this kind of displacement from happening? So this is why we became interested in land value capture as a fundamentally systemic intervention into exclusionary urban land markets. So that shows that as a concept, land value capture should not only be a fiscal tool, but that there are very important redistributive components that can underpin the concept. So we have a significant interest in land value capture in the role that it plays in advancing the spatial transformation agenda through particular tools. And in South Africa, we have a range of kind of relevant land value capture tools. We already have quite a well-established property tax. There's relatively well-established development or developer contributions. But what we're really focusing on, because of our objective of equitability, is interventions on the more strategic use and management of municipal land, as well as the responsibility to intervene on private land. But the big question is how? And I'm not sure that we have an answer yet. So the program that we've worked on for the last 3 years is between ourselves, the City Support Program, which is a national treasury player, so it's national government, and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And the goal really of this program is to build the capability of South African local government officials in order to implement land value capture towards realizing the spatial transformation agenda. And that little picture there is taken from an official's office in Johannesburg, which is why I put it there. So we're in a lot of offices all the time. We do this through 4 programmatic areas, but this is such a boring slide because what we actually do is this. And I think what is really important, what I really want to talk about today, is that fundamentally the program gives technical support and different kinds of technical support to government officials at different scales, right? But what's important is the crowding in of resources. This way of working, I call it anti-consulting. What we do is we take international experts, the community of practice, which was formed on the methodology of a dialogue in 2018, very similar to what Mona presented yesterday. So we take these experts, research institutions, and we crowd them into the technical support. We do the same with research, right? Answering specific research questions. And we do the same in terms of training young professionals. And obviously, universities and young professionals and students also play a role in production of research. So what does that actually look like? It's nice to make a little diagram, but let me walk you through it on the example of inclusionary housing. Inclusionary housing is a land value capture tool. I think there's many different kinds of land value capture, and some implementations of inclusionary housing aren't necessarily very value capture aligned. So the tool that we're talking about trying to institutionalize in this case is inclusionary housing as a land use planning mechanism to facilitate affordable housing in well-located areas built by private developers. So it means that the city identifies high-value properties where they need affordable housing. In the city of Cape Town, you saw was the entire central business district, right? Then it establishes an overlay zone, so you put additional development rights in that specific area, but they're conditional. So the city says you're allowed to build into the additional land use rights only under the condition that you provide affordable housing. And the cost of the affordable housing units is offset by the additional development that you're given. So instead of here, you're converting the additional value instead of into cash, you're converting it into affordable housing, into the public good that we're talking about. And the affordable units are made available for rent or for purchase. And now, okay, we're talking about institutionalization of land value capture tool. So we can say, okay, this is institutionalization of a land value capture tool. You have the early beginnings of a national policy. Then in 2015, a very important national policy, Splumer, comes along. It enshrines the principles of spatial transformation. We move to some local implementation of land value capture, provincial implementation. And there we have it. I'm going to use my new favorite word, yalla, let's go. This is it. That's institutionalization. It's not. What institutionalization actually looks like is this. And this is what we've been doing for the last 3 years to enable this process to happen. And this is only the policy process. And after policy, you need to talk about implementation, right? And implementation is changing the actual actions of public officials. And what you'll see over here is that I have you'll see how complex, this is another version of the kind of iterative method I put up earlier, of how we leverage in community of practice, events, technical support, research at particular times, depending on what's happening, right? And so just to go into some points of that, this whole thing started with a land value capture dialogue series that was a partnership between DAG and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Mona, I'm outing Enrique's objectives here. So this is very similar methodology to what you presented yesterday. And from that, we developed this more formalized program that can crowd in the resources, right, into these multi-stakeholder environments. So we're giving technical support. So for example, the City of Cape Town starts a feasibility study around inclusionary housing, led by consultants, of course, that have a particular frame of mind. And I'm not convinced that that frame of mind is always to protect the public interest, because they also work for property developers, right? So what we did is we got some technical experts and we made an external technical reference group that helped the lead official who was supposed to control the consultants and who the consultants were actually answering to. So they were standing in her corner, right? So then when the consultants were saying, no, you got this all wrong, it's all about developers' profit, she could say, no, this is about residual land value. So that's an example. Another example, and a key methodology, is this idea of working with champions. And I think it's something we talked about yesterday, right? That there are people in public office that do care. And what we're talking about here is that we target mid to senior level local government officials because in general, they're more stable and they're removed from a political kind of capture elite, right? And that our approach really is an accompaniment approach. It's not this once-off in-out. It's you can see that we accompanied the entire process over multiple years, right? And even once the policy might come into effect in Cape Town, you're still not done because you haven't implemented it. So it talks about the dynamism of implementation and institutionalization in terms of also proofing it from political intervention. And so a very cool thing that we did was inclusionary housing peer-to-peer learning sessions, quarterly sessions between lead officials. So these champions for inclusionary housing in all of the different cities and provinces. And it's a very informal conversation. It's unrecorded. And we have two consistent technical experts there. But they just kind of sit in the session. And if someone has a question, they'll help answer it. But they're not presenting. they're not significant. They're a resource to the lead officials. And this allows for these kind of informal conversations that are very helpful in terms of how do we actually institutionalize. And it's officials helping officials. And my job in that space is just to create the space and to make people feel safe. We continue, so that's the peer-to-peer inclusionary housing group. And then all these other questions come up, the idea of like, oh, but do we have the legal framework in South Africa? Well, then we're like, okay, we make a publication, we say, yes, we do have the legal framework. But why should Cape Town have this? This is why Cape Town should have it. So as these kind of arguments come up, you start debunking them, right? And so right now the legal argument is taken on a more nuanced approach, so we're working on a second legal piece, etc. You get the idea. We use dialogue methodologies. This was the most recent one last year, where you can see the diversity of stakeholders. And what we focused on here was that inclusionary housing was actually already happening because spatial segregation in Cape Town is so bad that even property developers know that they need to do something about it and that they're going to be taken to court if they don't by other activist organizations. So we continue in the process. And I think what's important about the entire process is to say it's not all technical. I think this really shows the importance of the softer technical support, right? So this is from one of our champions who's saying, you've managed to find a great balance between pushing for policy change and actually supporting government officials to achieve it. So I think this is this kind of like tug and pull that we need to navigate all the time. So what are the lessons from this? The lessons are that I very fundamentally believe about crowding and resources. My job is to convince all of you, academics, to come help me, help officials, right? And that we can do this in like bite-sized chunks. And we can do this through partnerships. I think academia, students have a very fundamental role to play in this. I think the methodology also shows the importance of multi-scalar approaches. So it wasn't just a national level, it wasn't just a local level. It's local level that informs a national level response that informs a provincial response. And it's unsorted. There's not like a clear up or down movement. I think the other thing is this idea of, well, we first need policy, and then we need implementation, and then we're going to start testing. What you can also see is that it was much more, you first work on the policy, then you get to a blockage there. Then we found a different municipality that was like, we're about to give away a whole lot of additional density. Let's try it. Let's condition this additional density with some affordable housing. Right? So then you move from policy back to testing, then you move towards implementation, then back to policy. And then you take the lessons that you learned. So it's a much more iterative approach. I think overall, also the big question of what does institutionalization mean? It's much more complex. And I think the key point also is land value capture a useful entry point is something that we've discussed a lot, right? And what we've found is that land value capture can be quite confusing as an entry point to municipal officials because they say, what does land value capture have to do with me? Because all the different parts of the value capture cycle sit often within different departments. So no one can inherently follow the whole value cycle across the municipality. And so a lot of our initial efforts were on the idea of officials understanding the value that they're creating. But I think this is also an opportunity because the technical support actually offers an opportunity then to create a transversal way of working in the municipality, which is essential for them to function better as well. So this is the kind of the pros and cons of the entry point. And then the big question is, does land value capture lead to this outcome that we're interested in terms of equitable urban development? The answer is the devil's in the detail. And I can already see all the hands going up in this room just now saying, well, inclusionary housing. I have a few things to say here. What are the definitions of affordability? Who will be able to stay in this? How long will it be affordable for? What kind of rental versus ownership models are you going to? Who will manage the units? Are you going to do on-site, off-site, or in lieu? And the answer to all of that is we don't know yet, and help me figure it out. Because you are the resources that I need to crowd in. And I'm not crowding them into myself, I'm crowding them into this case, mid to senior level public officials who are institutionalizing land value capture. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Claudia. I'd like to invite all the panelists to join me here. Claudia, this is a really wonderful presentation. I think it's sort of refreshing to see how such processes work and all the difficulties that entail the iterative process. I loved how you boxed in the consultants into the process. Now, just one question, just I'll leave you with that, and then we'll open the floor for questions. In terms of the lessons learned, I just want to push a little bit here. And once you see and you create this process, you bring in these, the academics, the government officials, the local government officials, and what have you, and you have these meetings. What happens after that? How are decisions made? Do they go and to their bosses or to their political parties or I don't know who to get the final say? Because some of that is not visible, right, around the table, right? So they all often tend to maybe agree in public in front of everyone else, but then we're really good to see your interpretation at least, because obviously that is not something probably was also publicly discussed, but we'll address that. Again, thank you to all. This was a fascinating panel in the sense that it just really sheds light on how these things are happening. We saw 3 cases from Amman to Kampala to Egypt and to South Africa. We saw two cases whereby I would say how the informal really rules the formal and all that complexity with it. And we saw a process whereby civil society is actually creating a process to open up the formal process in a way and be part of that. Let me start taking questions because we have, I believe, 25 minutes for, is that okay? 20. Let's go for 20 then, because, yeah. Do we have someone can give the microphone? Okay, great, thank you, the gentleman. And please introduce yourself, name and institution or organization, and make your questions very crisp, to the point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic panel. Just to be to the point, so we heard a little bit about the process in South Africa, but not even getting to the process of implementation, right? In the other 2 cases, we heard what appeared to be some implementation happening without a policy framework, without a law. What I really want to know more about is the negotiation, the bargaining. Is there anything you can tell us about what was going on in those informal processes to make that work? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Someone had,
yeah. Hi. Oh, thank you so much. That was really stimulating panel. My question is about the context that we're working in. I know this is city debates, but I'm really interested in these smaller towns that are rapidly urbanizing. And I was wondering if there are any lessons in particular to be learned from these towns that are maybe becoming cities or becoming city-like, in terms of the opportunities and the challenges for urban governance strategies, and particularly for land value capture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, great panel. My question is for Mohamad, because I know a little bit about the context in Egypt, and I'm curious to know if there are any efforts at all to engage landlords and community members in a reverse or a counter process, because I know a lot of the agricultural land is owned by single large families that monopolize the land, despite Nasser's attempts to democratize that. So I would love to hear the end of the landlords part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more? All right. Okay. One more. And
I'd like to ask Astrid, because the context of Uganda and that you presented and Amman is very similar in many ways to the Lebanese context and to Beirut. And so when you're talking about taxing property, was it mentioned in the discussion at any point that some property owners are very low income people and that they're unable to pay the taxes and that they might consider selling their properties to real estate developers instead because they can't pay these taxes?
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to give the panelists a chance to answer. Mohamad, you want to start? And let's go do it quite brief, 2 minutes max. Thanks.
Well, if I thanks. If I look at the negotiation and the dialogue, actually, there are two streams. There is one that is formal, the other one is informal, and in between there is plenty of. It's all the time negotiation, all the time, But it all depends what is the room available for this negotiation. Sometimes. And it depends on so many variables. If I would look at them one by one, it's about also people. In many cases, I see city leaders or people within different departments who are, despite all the challenges, legal, institutional, etc., are entrepreneur by nature, are boundary spanner. They reach out to people. In other cases, completely the opposite. Willing to take zero responsibility, are not interested in opening up to anyone, are risk averse, etc. So I think there's a huge variable about people, about leadership, about capacity of people within local government to open up. So that's one. Two, I think it's also about social media and to what extent this tool has been able to bring, what happened through the fragmentation of land ownership is that within a site you will have hundreds, if not thousands, of people on this, and the idea of bringing them in one place is almost impossible. But what happened with social media is that somehow the landowners come together. Somehow there's a WhatsApp group that was created for that particular site, and they are starting to debate it. And all the goods and the bads, if you look, I don't want to make it utopia. You will find in this, I happen to look at this WhatsApp group and see wonders, starting from irrelevant messages to hatred messages to cooperation to everything. So how social media is working from WhatsApp to Facebook groups, I think is something that I think we need to really understand a lot. Three, I would also look at the level of decentralization and a level of empowerment that are given to local governments and the incentive structure that is there to allow them to initiate this dialogue. In our context, it's very limited in the Egyptian context. Four, I would look at time. Is that starting in time? And I would say no. Usually if you look from historic institutionalism path or past dependency pathway, there is no very limited discussion. Then the revolution happened in Egypt in 2010, 2011. Then a boom happening of social engagement, too much social engagement, too much interest in the public debate. Then bit by bit, the window closed. I think we're back to square one. So negotiation and dialogue and is a time specific also. The last point I would say is actually the level of trust. And I saw within the same country different cities, and you will find a completely different level of trust between government and residents in it. Some of it I saw, for example, in Upper Egypt governorates, more trusting relationship between citizen and local governments than in the Delta, for example. What is the origin? I can try to make guesses, but I want to say a definitive answer of it. So I think understanding the social capital and the level of trusts between local government and citizen would be important, and it's, in my view, context specific.
Thanks. And also thanks to my panelists. I really learned a lot. I really enjoyed the panel too. So starting with what's going on in the bargaining process. Well, I think it's quite frankly just a need for infrastructure. So what the law, what the constitution says is that you have to compensate landowners if you take the land away, even for infrastructure development. What that means is, and the law is very murky in this context, is that without a cadaster, someone says you're going to build a road, guess what? Suddenly everyone has a title, suddenly there's speculation, and what you're compensating on is actually a very speculated value. So there's actually an estimate that even just for widening a road in Uganda, 60% of those costs are just compensating people, right? So it's super, super expensive. Partially the reason, as Tom said, the Kampala-Entebbe Expressway is now notorious for being the most expensive road per kilometer in the world. So what happens is that, and the other thing is donors don't pay that compensation. Like, it's part of their rules and regulations and their standards and their safeguards and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the government has to do it. Guess what? Our government doesn't have a lot of money. So you end up in a situation where someone like the World Bank comes and says, hey, cool, we're going to expand your road. And then you face all of these costs and compensation. The government can't pay it. The World Bank says, oh, our project timeline is ticking. We're going to take away the money. And then the road doesn't get implemented, right? And it's not just the World Bank, but since you're sitting here, I'm going to pick on you, but you also fund a lot of our roads. So the point is that people are starting to realize that this is a massive bottleneck to actually getting the infrastructure they need. And actually that infrastructure they need is going to help them more than all this wrangling here and there. But what I will say is that it's something that I want to explore more, if I find the time or the ability to do so. And I will also say it's on a very micro level, because once you start getting to the more lucrative, bigger levels, then you face the same sort of bottlenecks where there's a bit of NIMBYism. There's a bit of, oh, well, I could make a lot of money out of this. But I want to understand what's happening, because I want to see how you can scale from the bottom up. Smaller towns, expansion. Excellent question, because this is what I'm working on. And Uganda declared, when our president declares, things happen. That's how laws are made. Our president declared 10 new cities in July 2020. So now we have 10 new cities. And the question is, how do they not become the next Kampala? And that urban expansion slide, I think, is the best way. I see a lot of money being spent on total, I won't use the words here because I'm sitting on a panel and speaking in the microphone, but you can imagine what I want to say. And on the side note, I can totally endorse Hayes's call for funding the funding the Beirut Urban Lab, because it's one of the most inspiring things I've seen. And I don't say that lightly, because I see, but the urban expansion thing is the other thing I've really seen work, because it's a very bottom-up process with local officials who don't work on big plans, or, these are not consultant-led plans. These are just a whole bunch of, and I can also recommend looking at the New York University's Marin Institute. They've done this in a bunch of cities. It's fantastic work. And I've literally seen it work in very complex situations like Uganda. And I think that's about, that's what I would say to secondary cities. And I think that's the way forward. But there are no silver bullets. I should sort of footnote that. Finally, on the property tax, very good question, particularly because our property cadastre was last updated in 2005, and then 2016 was the next update. So you can imagine the increase in values. Our property tax is on a percentage of the value of the market rent, another hangover from colonial times. So the increase in value would have been enormous. What I think happened is there was a little bit of negotiation in the process, because actually when I just looked at the central district, we have 5 districts. When they took out the new property roll, of course, we're an opposition city as well. So, the mayor who's opposition comes out and says exactly the same things. But when it actually came down to it, there was only, and I don't remember the numbers exactly, but somewhere between 500 and 600 challenges to 16,000 property revaluations. That already says to me, and 60% of those were administrative. So it's like, oh, you spelled my name wrong. So that already says to me, like it's kind of same as the Amman case. When there's no legal challenges, I feel like people know they're getting a good deal. It just is my backward interpretation of the situation. So I think, in part, it was kind of taken into account in very fuzzy calculations that are particularly fuzzy anyway. But it is an ongoing discussion in the context, particularly of Kampala. The one other thing I'll say in Kampala, though, again, when our president declares, we do. So before the elections in 2006, he made a promise to his future voters. I don't even know why he does this, because he just gets voted in every time anyway. But he said to the future voters, he said, we're going to do an owner-occupied exemption, which means that if you occupy the house that you live in, you don't pay property tax. And guess what? Again, fuzzy laws mean that there's no ceiling on how many houses you can claim that you are owner-occupied, right? So I think that's the other part of the answer to your question.
Thank you so much. I think The one thing I also want to say is thank you to my panelists, and also to echo Astrid on saying there's no silver bullet. And I think that's also with inclusionary housing, that is a tool that, you know, it's filling a gap market, a very specific segment of the housing market in Cape Town and well-located areas. Well, the other kind of phenomenon that we're working on in Cape Town, which is really interesting, is affordable rental in previously marginalized areas, where you have people informally densifying previous state-subsidized housing estates or housing properties, and helping the institutional, the formal institution catch up to the informal institution that actors have created, right? So that's just to show that kind of there is no silver bullet, and you have these actors, formal institutions and informal institutions. The other question I had was how do decisions get made? And I think the very easy answer to that is politics and power. And that's something that we kind of came towards at the end of the day yesterday. We started speaking about power and power of decision making. And I think what Rachel said in terms of enabling the municipal officials to kind of negotiate at the table, and what Tom's also saying, this ability to bargain from the public sector against private developers who have vested interests in very high political areas that then counteract specific decision making within a municipality. And so it's about capacitating the government officials, the mid-level government officials. But it's also about creating these dialogues and speaking, for example, with the private developers before inclusionary housing policy is on the table. To say, you know, to talk about what would this look like. And then I think the other question around secondary cities is super interesting. And I have such a good example. So Cape Town's a really big city. And then there's a small kind of secondary city just off of it. And we've been working on institutionalizing inclusionary housing in Cape Town for 3-4 years by now, probably longer. 5, Helen's saying 5. And it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And to some degree, it's because of politics and power, and because to a different degree, it's so big. So then we started working with Stellenbosch, the small municipality, intensively. They kind of got onboarded into our process 1.5 years ago. And 2 weeks ago, they adopted their draft inclusionary zoning policy because they could get all the relevant departments and actors into the room much quicker. So I think that's there's real opportunity in secondary cities for the institutionalization process to happen much faster, and they can be much more innovative in testing, and they're much more capacity constrained. So that, you know, if we're using a particular methodology of crowding and resources, you kind of create gains much quicker, and that allows you the kind of testing that you need to create an evidence base to go to the big cities and say, let's do it, and it worked.
Great, thank you. All right, I think first I would like to thank our panelists for a really wonderful discussion, for pushing the debate forward, particularly on how to think about these issues. And again, I don't need to state again the whole relationship between formal and informal, but also the process and the process you've created as well. I think this is really food for thought for us to reflect and to build on. Given that I'm under a lot of pressure because it's almost lunchtime. It is lunchtime, in fact. Yeah. So exactly, we're running very, very late. So I suggest we move for lunch, and we can continue the debate over lunch. And once again, thank you so much for everyone, for the panelists, and for your participation.